Howdy. If this is your first time seeing me, which it probably is, I'm Red Cap Illustrations, though you can just call me Red, and I'm a comic illustration artist who started making and releasing his first webcomic last year, Healing a Wilted Flower. It's a sort of modern fantasy slice-of-life mystery type comic following 3 characters dealing with their day-to-day problems with underlining themes of mental health and such, all while having to uncover the secrets kept under lock and key within their city. I started releasing pages of this comic back in September of last year, but had been writing, storyboarding, and just generally laying out the story itself since as far back as January. The first page I even drew was actually back in late March, which was mostly because it was my first full dive into comic making, which despite a couple of smaller ones I made in the past, I had to learn in the slowest way possible the best ways to optimize making pages faster, while also making them, good. Though if I'm being honest, this comic, at least in general story concepts and such, is actually something I've been making since early 2022. And that's because originally my comic was supposed to be a D&D campaign with a much more action-packed narrative, along with being much more of a typical medieval type fantasy, rather than the current modern take I ended up going with. So what happened? Well, my first actual introduction to D&D was when a friend of mine decided to bring his entire D&D kit to my 19th birthday party. He'd been determined for a while to introduce us properly, since not many of us had actually ever played before. Though, to be fair, it was probably more so an excuse for him just to DM, but regardless. I decided to make a quick character based off my OC at the time, Tigerclaw, and we did a quick one-shot finding a bunch of mer creatures on a beach and such. The details are a little bit foggy, but I mostly remember us defending a nearby island from these creatures while also having to evacuate the people, since the island was apparently sinking. Either way, after the entire thing, we got rather hooked. That one-shot later ended up becoming an entire campaign with a group of my buddies. As for that one-shot character, I ended up writing a complete backstory for him. I gave him a brand new name that was later introduced into the campaign, Philip, and even made a whole character design just for this. I had just started getting into digital art at the time though, and you can kind of clearly notice that with this. Honestly, D&D was partly an excuse for me to draw more characters than anything else. That one thing that definitely held true though ever since my D&D craze started was my love for making characters. The motivations, the backstories, personalities, struggles, everything. The role-playing aspect of D&D was without a doubt the real reason I was so enthralled. It kind of helped that sort of storytelling itch I've had for a while. It was essentially my form of a creative outlet, and to have people actually be there and react to my characters in real time, that was magical to me. And yeah, that's what got me into D&D. I later joined a second campaign not long after the first, and we went extra hard into it. I made a Hellhound Hexblade Warlock character that I made while having to live in my uncle's house, as our house was completely unlivable due to a hurricane causing the roof to fall in. I might go into more detail about that in a future video, but for now we're just going to kind of gloss past that. The character was named Aya, and I gave him a fully fledged backstory and a full-on design that I remade 3 different times throughout the time I played as him. It was almost kind of like a nice, neat little way of showing the character kind of growing, and it was pretty fun to actually be able to draw them more over time and see my style start to improve. I even wrote the equivalent of a short story with this character and the life he had before he was a Hellhound. Essentially, Aya was immortal, his father was a Hellhound, while his mother was just from an unknown wolf race. The story itself was meant to be told in a memory format similar to Breath of the Wild, where he would recover them in a kind of trigger format and remember specific ones kind of out of order. For general story deets, Aya's father was rather despised by Hell's Rings because of his betrayal to their kind and his engagement to a mortal, and out of anger once they found out, they sent a hellborn snake to bite one of the children as punishment. While the snake was aiming for Aya's brother Iza, it ended up biting Aya after he lunged himself in front of his brother to protect him. The rest of the memories are just rather somber, depressing ones of him slowly getting sicker and sicker. His father, after finding out the bite had infernal traces, decided to return to Hell and try to give his life for the life of his son. Though, his father was double-crossed and unable to secure the life of his son. He was murdered by those demons. Aya's last memories of his real life was his mother singing him his favorite lullaby as he passed on. And as he drifted off into the next life that awaited him, he woke up and found himself in a fiery wasteland, and was taken in by a lone tiefling, who found him on the outer edge of one of Hell's Rings. And I never ended up using any of this. I unfortunately had a lot of disagreements with the DM I had at the time, who was much more of an epic storyteller type DM than a role-playing one. They were more so focused on climactic fights and spectacles than the smaller moments, building up characters. Which is not necessarily a bad thing, it's just not really what I was looking for as a player. Eventually, I ended up having way too many scheduling conflicts and was forced to put them on the shelf. along with its lore. Seeing as I haven't played Aya in over a year now, I don't think I'll ever be going back to go finish this story. Around this time, I started having ideas of the ways I'd run a campaign and how I'd write a compelling story if I were DMing something. I went back and forth with ideas a lot, coming up with an entire world and storylines just in my head, usually while bored out of my mind at work. The concept of making my own campaign seemed so exciting in my mind. I could write compelling stories and make an expansive world for others to have fun in, rather than just making a singular character my friends would enjoy. Eventually, I ended up deciding, you know what? Screw it. I'm gonna make my own campaign. Did I literally have any experience DMing? I didn't care how difficult it would be to learn, nor did it matter to me how large in scope I was going to make it. I just started immediately planning out and writing down ideas for the story, along with notes about the world and its history. I designed an entire map myself that was meant to be more so a whimsical kind of pop-up book. And as you can tell, I'm not the greatest at naming things. I had a general mix of common D&D races, with a few custom ones that I felt would kind of expand the world a bit more and make it a bit more lively and more original. The more exciting part to me was definitely making the world itself and its lore. The idea of being able to tell my players and have them react in real time to the world around them, that was amazing to me. I even went as far as to make 2D NPC characters on top of that to tag along with the group in select points in the story. I made full designs for them too. The first was a Shiba Inu artificer character, and the other a dragonborn monk that hailed from a clan of sword dragons. I went back and forth with the names a lot and kinda ended up getting stumped with them for a while. I ended up naming the dragon Arashi after the Japanese word for storm. It's also apparently the name of a Japanese boy band. While the Shiba character was actually named by one of my friends who helped me to try to find some good Japanese inspired names and listed a good couple. I ended up landing on the name Chiharu and just never looked back. So what went wrong exactly with the DMing plan? Well, first off, I ended up changing and altering the story a lot as I went on with it, constantly going back and forth between changing lore bits or just generally changing future plot points as I felt that they weren't really what I was going for. Which for a first DM, that's rather normal. But I really started to wonder exactly how I was going to lay out the story and its contents to my players. How would I steer them towards the right places, and what could I do if they decided to go a different way? I'd have to really improve on my improv skills. Players are incredibly unpredictable and can make decisions on the fly, and you, as the DM, has to account for it. The worst type of DM is the one who straight up restricts you to following a specific path and prevents any alterations or anything. It's like playing a video game and the game forces you to be a dick to someone with no other option, and now you've somehow created a villain despite not wanting to because it wouldn't let you do so otherwise. That's basically what it's like. I had to account for everyone's characters as well, their backstories, storylines, motivations, and their ties to the lore as a whole. So not only would I have a large storyline that was spanned across an entire world, I'd have to make several different plot points for player characters so that way they actually feel like they were a part of the world and not just background characters or NPCs. It was just a lot. Yet I was still going for it. I knew it was going to be a lot to manage and a lot to improvise on the fly, but I still did not care. If it meant I could share something I poured my soul into, then it was worth it in my eyes. But another thing I felt rather limited by was the world itself. Technically speaking, D&D can be limitless. There really isn't guidelines you have to stick to, but changing the fundamentals requires a lot more work. You have to completely redo stats and magic systems and such. While you can definitely just reuse specific actions or abilities and just rename or rework them, it would be a daunting task, one usually taken by much more experienced DMs. What I really wanted to do was make a campaign set in a much more modern era, that or based in the 1970s to 1990s, but I just felt at the time that the amount of work required was just too daunting for the vision I had, especially as a new DM. So I just decided to keep it a much more medieval steampunk era to not have it change too much of the actual fundamentals. But after a while, I did attempt to try to introduce some more modern technology. Essentially, my idea was that parts of the world were closer to modern advancements, while others decided to remain more traditional. Thus, only certain places in the world would have things like modern transportation, while others would have things kinda like just typical carts and wagons. Which in theory sounded like a good bridge between trying to go for the time period I was wanting to do, while also not making such a drastic change to where I'd have to completely undo and reconstruct entire systems. But the more I tried to reconstruct, the more I kept having to change. As the months went by, I was continuously motivated yet terrified. It felt like I had most of the major parts of my campaign done and thought out, and yet, not at all. So finally I decided to prepare myself for DMing by trying to do a few one-shots, just to prepare myself for the inevitable conglomerate of a campaign I had looming over my head. I was recommended by some of my DMing friends to use a pre-made one and just alter it a bit. You know, to make it a bit beginner-friendly for Baby's first campaign. So of course, in my typical creative fashion, I decided it would be better to give a bit more heart into my own one-shot. Yeah, so I ditched the idea of a pre-made campaign and just decided to make my own. I decided on a typical murder mystery that took place in the world of my campaign that would just be completely separate from anything in the main story, but a rather nice first dive into the world I was going to offer. It was going to take place in a city similar to New Orleans, and the players would be members of a prom committee who were invited by a wealthy family who owned the school they attended. As the night would go on, however, people would start to disappear. The killer, which would be one of the players, would have stats that would allow them to almost insta-kill another player, but the regular players would have attributes that would give them a chance to get away and alert the others. I even painstakingly drew an entire 2.5D map of the plantation that would be the main setting because I wanted to add a bit more flair to my one-shot. In the end, after 2 months of planning and getting set players for it, I ended up abandoning it. I spent an entire week just trying to plan out the first murders with the killer who was helping me to just try to keep the intrigue as much as possible. But it just ended up being too much for me to manage, and too much of a headache to try to get right. Not too long after that, I started to doubt my own campaign even more. Would I even be able to manage it if I couldn't even do a simple one-shot? Finally, by late November, I had the entire campaign on hold. I couldn't really do the idea I wanted to do because of conflicts with not only the world, but the randomness of how D&D could be. Whatever way I wanted to direct the story, it just felt too restricting, rather than letting players choose and have fun. Plus, the new characters I made would basically never really see the light of day. They'd really only be able to be used once and never again, unless I wanted them to act like glorified babysitters for the party, which obviously you don't want to do. Then, close to New Year's, I was playing Minecraft with a couple friends, and we had just been chilling and talking about random stuff while I was just building a house and whatnot, you know, typical Minecraft stuff. Eventually, I started venting about the entire campaign and just realizing the time investment as well, not only in preparation, but in the overall length it'll be. I was unsure what I was going to do, and if I could even do this thing at all. I just wanted to tell a good story. Finally, my friend asked why I didn't just make it into a comic. For a while, I had been having a real itch to make comics, but I hadn't really had a good idea for any. I had the idea of running the campaign first, and then using it maybe as inspiration for a comic afterwards. But eventually my mind caved, and I realized in the long run, both creatively and for my own health, just making it into a comic would be so much easier. I'd have way more creative control and be able to structure the story how I wanted. It also kind of eased my anxiety a bit of having to live up to my players' hopes and expectations for how I was going to handle their characters. And finally, my brain was set. I was just going to make a comic instead. That way I can make it just how I want and not have to worry about the limitations caused by it being a campaign. I took the existing story I made for the campaign and recompiled and recontextualized it into more of the comic format I was looking for, which took about 2.5 months. All of January to the middle of March was completely dedicated to outlining and script lining, which led to changing the main storyline itself. The original idea was an action-packed adventure-type story, which for the D&D format worked, perfectly, while the new one I ended up landing on after multiple drafts was a more laid-back story that focused on the characters rather than the world itself. The main story's general theme hadn't really changed, but it was redone to kind of fit the vibe I was aiming for. It was always meant to be focused a good amount on things like mental issues and even grief. So I just realized it'd be a lot better to tell a more personal storyline rather than some sort of action-packed epic one. All in all, the many drafts of the storyline and opening parts of the comic have changed a lot through those months. Not even gonna lie, entire story deets were completely changed and thrown out while I was making the first couple pages. Same with the final designs of my characters. Which, now that we're on that subject, oh my god, the amount of times I had to change these characters. Okay, so you know those one-off DMPC characters I made a long time ago? Well, I still planned for them to be essential characters later on in the campaign I was making, Then when I finally decided to turn it into a comic, their entire designs, personalities, and motivations were brought to the forefront since I was making them into main characters instead. Their original versions were completely changed from how they were as D&D characters. This was their first draft, at least in terms of design. They're both inspired by traditional Japanese clothing along with their designs. Chiharu in his early designs was actually more of a white wolf in concept. Become his first finished design, I based him off a Shiba Inu, which is a more common dog breed found in Japan, along with being the most iconic dog meme known to man. Arashi, on the other hand, was based on a mixture of traditional Japanese depictions of dragons, and just general interpretations of what storm dragons are. Out of both characters, Arashi I feel was the one that gave me the most trouble, simply because I had no idea what I was doing with him. Great example, Chiharu throughout his year and a half of rework has only had 3 major redesigns: his original version, his pre-comic design, and his post-comic design. Throughout them, you could definitely notice a bit of change, like his shorter height and more Shiba attributes. Arashi had 5 to 6. I don't really know why I had to remake Arashi as many times as I did, but my best guess is just because I was never 100% what I wanted him to be. Because of that, it was a constant experiment with different designs and silhouettes just to see what I felt stuck better, both in terms of personality and just generally as a design. If Chiharu was more of a quick little character swap, Arashi was the equivalent of a Bethesda character creator to me. I could not stop changing aspects of him. His original design looked fine, definitely fit the style I was going for at the time, but not really what I wanted in the long run. His second was more so a different angle, but I ended up making him a bit too muscular, so his third one was kind of compensating for that with a much more slimmer design and my first actual crack at a much more modern interpretation. I hated this design. After that, I had a lot of sketching redesigns I made before eventually landing on his pre-comic design, and oh boy. Overall, I do like aspects of this design. The clothing was heavily inspired by typical Japanese fashion, which is held true for his current iteration as well. However, everything else was just off. I mean, this one looks like it got hit by a frying pan in all honesty. Either way, both of these designs were the basis when I started drawing the actual pages. However, it was clear after I drew the first few pages that their character sheets became almost null and void, as I ended up changing them again. It wasn't really till I made their post-comic designs that they finally seemed to click. Although Arashi did get a small touch-up in a proper character sheet a couple weeks after, it wasn't a drastic change compared to where it came from. It's also because personality and dynamic-wise, both their characteristics had completely changed and even swapped with one another. Originally, Chiharu was a lot more of the pure one, while Arashi was actually a bit more of a relaxed, kind of semi-cocky one. Chiharu ended up becoming much more of a chaotic character, but still rather determined in his goals, which is shown in his work as an engineer. Though he still has a rather caring demeanor, it's usually safe for those he cares for most. Chiharu can, however, be rather distant from others. Arashi's personality became much more of a respectful, caring type of role. He tries his best to be the best he can for the people he cares for, and helps them in any way that he can. He always tries to treat everyone he meets with absolute respect, though he has trouble giving himself that very same respect at times. I am pretty pleased with how they turned out, and though through a lot of thick and thin, I do believe how I got them now is pretty good for the story I actually want to tell. But anyway, general design and character tangent over. The outlining and storyboarding process was the most difficult part. I believe I ended up redoing the opening part a good 5-ish times, mostly because I wanted to get it right. I didn't probably start drawing the first couple pages till late March, and only started releasing it in September, where I had a good 14-ish pages. It probably would have taken less time if I had drawn other comics beforehand, cause, I'm gonna be honest, I kinda started learning much more of the fundamentals in comic making and such the further I went in. You can notice this in some of my pages actually. The first pages are almost all exclusively squarish panels, with some dialogue boxes overlapping with the art. However, in many of the newer pages, I started using more out-of-the-box panel designs. I had better designs and references for the characters, and had the dialogue in mind while making the newer ones as well, so the dialogue didn't overlap with the art. Overall, that's pretty much how I turned my D&D campaign into my first ever comic. It took a lot of time and a lot of reworking for me to do, but I definitely think it was worth it. It's also really nice having people legitimately interested in my characters and my comic in general. If you were intrigued through watching all of this somehow and would like to maybe see more, you can read my comic Healing a Wilted Flower right now on Webtoon, Tapas, and my own personal site, which will be in the description below. I release new episodes that consist mostly of 1 to sometimes 2 pages every 3 weeks, mostly because I'm still working a part-time job, and now with YouTube and TikTok taking up some of my comic making time, it can be a little hard. Now for the YouTube rigmarole. If you like this video, maybe consider subscribing. I'm really wanting to make a proper footing on YouTube, as it's been kind of a little dream of mine since I was a kid, but I know it definitely takes time, and it's completely unknown if the YouTube algorithm will take pity on a rather new YouTuber on the scene. But yeah, if y'all would like to see more videos and speed draws like this in the future, let me know. I'm definitely more experimenting right now and seeing what sticks, and I'd definitely like to know what y'all think. Anyway, with that, thank you all for watching, and have a great one. Ciao!